always do, because we need to be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. We have to know the enemy's schemes and where the enemy wants to attack. And so we need to be aware of the wiles of the devil. So let's be on our toes. Let's stay alert and focused and serving him. And while at the same time, let's relax in him and enjoy his presence and allow him to minister his spirit to us in whatever manner that he sees we need ministering to, in those areas of our life that we need to turn over to him. And so I pray that that's something that we're all cognizant of today. And so now let's get into this word about Melchizedek. The title of our teaching today is Melchizedek, Priest of El Most High, and that's the way the Hebrew Scriptures present it. El Most High. El is, of course, a shortened form of Elohim. And we see that shortened form, El, many times throughout the Old Testament. It's usually just translated God in our English Bibles. But there is El and there's Elohim, and they mean the same thing. It's just, El is just, like I said, a shortened form, often a poetic shortened form. Just like Yah is a shortened form, a poetic form of the full name Yahweh. And so Melchizedek is described as priest of El Most High. The reason this teaching is important, as I've alluded to already today, is that we have in the Messianic world this idea that if we align ourselves with Jewish people, with the people of the lineage in Israel, that Elohim is going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to the Jews. And often those promises made in Genesis 12 are interpreted to be how we treat the Jews is how Elohim is going to treat us. He said, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. And yet, in Abraham's time, there were no Jews. I don't know if you realize that. The Jews didn't come till much later. I mean, hundreds of years, 400 or so years later was when the tribe of Judah, the sons of Jacob, sprang up and became families and tribes among the offspring of Jacob, who is Israel. And so those promises made to Abraham, the point I'm trying to get to, was made to those who are of the faith of Abraham. Okay? It's not about ancestry, it's not about genealogy, it's not about offspring. It's about those who walk in the faith and the trust and the relationship that Abraham had with the Almighty. That's what the promises are all about, and that's to whom the promises will be fulfilled. And Paul makes that clear. We've seen that in the book of Ephesians and the book of Galatians and other places as well, that the seed being referred to there in the promise was Messiah. It wasn't Isaac. Isaac was the offspring of Abraham and the son to whom the promises were being passed to. And then Jacob after him, and then the tribes of Israel after him. And so there was a progression. There was a certain way in which Elohim wanted to fulfill his promises through the offspring, but that was never his intention. This is one of the mysteries that I spoke of. The mystery that Elohim wasn't relying upon a physical offspring in order to fulfill his promises, but a people who would embrace his ways And those people are those who, according to Paul, belong to Messiah. And so really the promises made to Abraham were made to us as well. We are the recipients of those promises because we belong to Messiah. There are many people who are of the lineage and ancestry who hate the one that we call Messiah. They have nothing to do with him. They fight against him. They're in rebellion against the Most High. And throughout the history of the people of Israel, this has been the case, where the people didn't want to follow Yah's laws and right rulings. They wanted to go their own way. They wanted to have it the way of the nations. And they wanted to worship the idols of the nations because they thought that the nations had a good thing going. And so they wanted to be a part of that. They weren't trusting in Yahweh for the fulfillment of his promises for them. And so again, it's not about physical ancestry. And so we're going to see that Melchizedek was not a priest according to a certain ancestry. He was priest of El Most High. And so let's begin at the beginning, at the first occurrence of the appearance of Melchizedek, and that's in Bereshit, Genesis chapter 14. And I'm going to just read this account just to kind of set the stage so that we can see who this Melchizedek is and how he entered onto the stage of human history and of salvation history. Genesis chapter 14. It says, it came to be in the days of Amraphel, the king of Shinar, Arioch, the king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and Tidal, the king of Goyim, that they fought against Bera, the king of Sodom, Birsha, king of Amorah, or Gomorrah, Shinab, the king of Admah, Shemeber, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Soar. And all these joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea, which is the Dead Sea. 12 years they served Kedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and struck the Rephaim in Ashtoreth Karnaim, and the Zuzim in Ham, and the Emites in Shawa Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their mountain of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. And they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and struck all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who dwelt in Hatzetzon Tamar. And the king of Sodom, and the king of Amorah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and joined together in battle in the valley of Siddim against Kedorlaomer, king of Eliam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. And the valley of Siddim had many tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food and went away. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and they left. And one who had escaped came and informed Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and they had a covenant with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he and his servants divided against them by night, and struck them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is on the left of Damascus or Damashek. And so he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. And so if you look at a map, Damascus is pretty far north of Canaan. I mean, it's a good I don't know, 60 miles, I guess, something of that nature. And so Abram and his 318 trained men went a long way to retrieve Lot. His interest, of course, was primarily Lot, his own relative, and Lot's goods. And so he went as far as Damascus, or Damasek, and he rescued Lot. And he defeated Kedorlaomer and the other kings with him. And it says, and after his return from the striking of Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom, or Sodom, came out to meet him at the valley of Shaweh. That is the king's valley. And then here we go. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was the priest of the Most High El. And he blessed him, and he said, blessed be Abram of the Most High El, possessor of the heavens and earth. And blessed be the Most High El, who has delivered your enemies into your hand, and he gave them a tenth of all. And so here is Melchizedek, the priest, blessing the Almighty and thanking him for his deliverance of Abram, who went after Lot, and Lot himself and his family. Because the Most High provided that deliverance from their enemies. And Yahweh is to receive the credit. And this priest of the Most High El recognizes this, that the Most High is the one responsible. Abram and his 318 trained men were, I guess, a formidable opponent, but probably in comparison to Kedorlaomer and four other kings, four other nations, they were the underdog in that battle. And so Elohim gave them the victory. He was able to rescue Lot and all the possessions. And then here's what it says about the king of Sodom, because the king of Sodom was one of those other kings. And I suspect by what it says here and what it says afterwards in 15 verse 1, that Abram was a little bit leery of this king of Sodom. It says that the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the people and take the goods for yourself. That is, upon his return, when he retrieved the goods. But Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to Yahweh, the Most High El, possessor of heavens and earth, not to take a thread or a sandal strap or whatever is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich, except only what the young men have eaten and the portion of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion. So Abram didn't want to take anything from the king of Sodom, any of the possessions that Abram recovered for the king of Sodom. It was all returned to him because Abram wanted Elohim to receive the credit. He didn't want to form an alliance with this king of Sodom, because we all know what happens soon hereafter with Sodom and Gomorrah because of the wickedness of those cities. And the king of Sodom had much to do with this. And so Abram recognized the character of the king of Sodom and didn't want to form any kind of alliance. And then it says in 15 verse 1, and then I'll stop there. After these events, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not be afraid, Avram. I am your shield. Your reward is exceedingly great. So evidently, Avram was somewhat reluctant about this king of Sodom. There was a threat there that the king of Sodom posed to him. And so Abraham was assured by the Almighty not to be afraid, because he was going to be Abram's shield, his protection against his enemies. So let's look at Melchizedek. It says Melchizedek was the king of Salem. In this second paragraph here on the slide, it says Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of Elohim Most High, or El Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, blessed be Avram, by Elohim Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be Elohim Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. And then Avram gave him, Melchizedek, a tenth of everything. And so this is significant because what we're seeing here, and we're going to go over this in another slide in a few minutes, is there's another aspect of Torah that is pre-Sinai. Two things, in fact, that we're seeing from this passage. There is a priesthood that precedes that of the priesthood of Aaron and his sons, which was given at Sinai. And there is a tithe that was instituted, or at least practiced. I'm not sure when it was instituted, but it was certainly here practiced by Abram when he gave a tenth of all of the plunder to Melchizedek. Now Melchizedek was priest of El Most High, and we know that from Levitical law, it's the sons of it was Aaron and his sons that received the first portion of the gifts and offerings that were given to Israel, to the tribe of Levi. Levi was set aside from receiving an inheritance of land, and we're going to get into this in more detail next week. But the Levites were selected among the tribes of Israel to minister the tabernacle, and specifically within the tribe of Levi, Aaron and his sons were to be priests. But there was a priesthood before Sinai, and that's what we're seeing here. It was Melchizedek's order of priesthood. And so this idea of priesthood was not new at Sinai. Another indication that Sinai was not the beginning of the law. There was something that began at Sinai. It was the Aaronic priesthood and the Levitical service that began at Sinai. But all the rest of the laws and right rulings were established and put into practice before Sinai. So Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So what does Melchizedek mean? And we find this explained. I mean, I can give you the Hebrew and break it down myself, but the book of Hebrews says it well. Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of Elohim Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, his name means king of righteousness. Melchizedek literally means king, from the word melech, king, and tzedek, or righteousness. Melchizedek means the king of righteousness. And then also king of Salem means king of peace. And it says without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, like the son of Elohim, he remains a priest forever. So the writer to the Hebrews is describing this Melchizedek and trying to lay some context for us about who he is. He said he's like the son of Elohim. Some people have proffered this theory that Melchizedek was a pre-incarnate revelation or manifestation of Messiah because of the obvious parallels that we see. The Messiah was to be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And yet the writer of the Hebrews says he was like the son of Elohim, not that he was the son of Elohim. So what do we know about the king of Salem? Who is Melchizedek? He was, first of all, he was a man. He was a real man. He was not the son of Elohim in the same sense that the Messiah is the son of Elohim. He was the king of Salem. Salem was the old name for Jerusalem. And this is significant too because, of course, this is where Yahweh established his temple later on in the days of David and Solomon, that the temple was set up there in Jerusalem. And the service was brought to Jerusalem. This was the city of David. And so King of Salem, this King of Salem was the king over that region that is now Jerusalem. And so it kind of prefigures the Messiah, like the son of Elohim, as the writer to the Hebrews says. He's without genealogy. And this doesn't mean that Melchizedek didn't have a genealogy. I think what the writer to the Hebrews is pointing out is that there was no genealogy given in the book of Genesis about where this Melchizedek came from. There's no record of it in the book of Genesis. And so the point that Hebrews is making is that it's not about genealogy, as I was speaking about earlier. His priesthood is not about his genealogy, and so therefore no genealogy is given to Melchizedek, although he was a man and he had a genealogy. It's just not revealed as part of why he was the priest of El Most High. He was the priest of El Most High on the basis of his life and his dedication and his service to Elohim. The Jewish writings identify Melchizedek as Shem, which I find to be very interesting, because Shem would have qualified to be the priest of the Most High. The reason for that is, of course, Shem was one of the three sons of Noah, and if you look at the lifespan of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and then you trace the genealogies through all the way to Abram, what you'll discover, and there are charts that kind of put this in picturesque form where the lifespans of all these individuals are laid out and we can see who was contemporary to whom, is that Shem was still alive and kicking during the days of Abram. So Shem would have been that righteous man of Elohim who was the head of the families of the righteous people on earth who were serving Elohim. And so he would have been king, as it were. It's like, I know we recognize that the scriptures present a patriarchal society where the men are given leadership position, they're heads of families, they're the ones that receive inheritance, and the women are married to men. But the women don't carry those things with them. They don't carry the inheritance as the men and the boys do in the family. And so I guess the point I'm trying to get to is that Shem would have been that righteous person during the days of Abraham. He would have been the head and leader and ruler, the elder among the people that served Elohim. And so therefore he would qualify as the Melchizedek. He walked uprightly before Elohim, and therefore he was Zedek. He was righteous. He was a Melech because he was a king, and he was a leader and a ruler, and specifically in the city of Salem, which was Jerusalem. And so it makes a lot of sense. Now I'm not saying 100% that Shem was Melchizedek, but it certainly fits the profile. And it makes perfect sense because Shem was that individual who carried on. We've talked about in the past, especially around Pesach, the importance of passing on the traditions and the teachings of Elohim from generation to generation. And this is our responsibility, is to teach our children the commandments. When we rise up and when we lie down, when we walk along the road and when we sit at home, we're to teach our children. And we're also to teach on the anniversary of Pesach every year, the anniversary of the deliverance from Egypt. We're to teach our children what happened and how we experienced that with the sons of Israel at that time. And so all of these traditions, all of this knowledge of Elohim is passed down through the generations by godly men and women, and the responsibility falls primarily upon the man of the house, the husband, the leader in Israel. And so therefore Shem took upon himself that responsibility. He was the Melchizedek. In the sense, I'm suggesting that not that he 100% was this Melchizedek, the Melchizedek, but he was a king. He was a leader and ruler, and he was a righteous man. And so Shem makes perfect sense to be the Melchizedek. The reason this is important is because it bears out, once again, how we are to pass on the traditions and the teachings, and how we are to take upon ourselves the responsibility of teaching our children from generation to generation the ways of Elohim. Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of El Most High. Now, there were 3 offices which are anointed offices or positions in Israel, and those are prophet, priest, and king. Some individuals carried all 3 offices, prophet, priest, and king. Melchizedek was specifically named to be a king, as part of his title name, Melchizedek, and priest. He was priest of El Most High. So he was a king and a priest. And so let's look at this idea of a kingdom of priests that we get from Exodus chapter 19, when Yahweh was preparing his people to appear before him at Sinai on the mountain, and he was going to speak with his own voice from the mountain the words, the 10 words, which were being delivered to Israel. He wanted all the people to hear his voice. And so in Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, it says, now, he's telling Moshe to tell the people this, now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests. And there's the phrase, the expression I want to examine real quick here. And a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the sons of Israel. And so the Hebrew on that, kingdom of priests, is Mamlechet Kohanim. And it literally means kingdom, from the word for kingdom. It's a kingdom of priests. The New Testament seems to somehow or other translate this, I think it's in the book of Revelation, that we would be kings and priests instead of a kingdom of priests. And I'm not sure how that got derailed off of the original expression here in the book of Exodus. But what Elohim said would be that they would be a kingdom of priests. And so what we find in Israel was for the first, from the time they came out of Egypt and entered into the land, and then for 380 years, the tabernacle was in Shiloh, and then the Ark of the Covenant eventually got moved along the way toward Jerusalem, because David was initiating that move of the Ark of the Covenant. What we find is that Israel was a kingdom of priests. Israel was ruled by priests, not by kings. The kingdom was ruled by priests, and this was Elohim's plan for Israel, is that they would be a kingdom of priests, ruled by the priests. And so why did Elohim desire for Israel to be ruled by the priests instead of by a king? And first of all, we see that the kings of the nations of the world typically are we call that a monarchy, where one person rules a nation. Kings tended to be selfish and demanding of the people. So by putting great demands on people, the king could build up his own little thing. He could live in a mansion, and he could have servants, and he could have everything he ever wanted. But that wasn't Elohim's plan for those who were going to rule and reign in Israel. Those who were going to rule Israel were to be judges. They were to be impartial judges in Israel. They were to rule the people in justice and in righteousness, and not by their own whim, which is what the kings of the world typically how they operate. And so Israel was to be a kingdom of priests, and Melchizedek was an example of a person who reigned. It says he was the king of Salem. He was a priest, and so he reigned as a priest, even though he was the king in Salem. And it was on account of the fact that the priests are accountable to the Almighty that priests are a better fit for ruling a righteous people than a king would be. Because the priests, in theory, although it didn't always work out in practice, the priest was to get his instructions from the Almighty. A monarchy was where a king rules. A theocracy is where Elohim rules. And so the priests were to listen and inquire of the Almighty to get instructions, to get advice on difficult to rule cases. And in all aspects of the life of Israel, the priests were to inquire of the Almighty and get instructions directly from Him, and not by their own wisdom, by their own experience. And so this is why priests are a better fit for ruling the righteous people of Elohim. So now we're going to return back to this slide is kind of a summary of what I alluded to earlier. Laws that were in operation pre-Sinai, of which we've added these last two on this list today in our teaching about Melchizedek. We saw in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, that the appointed times were established in the beginning during creation week. These are laws that are given at Sinai and detailed in Leviticus 23, things that were re-explained and redelivered at Sinai, but they weren't started at Sinai. And so all of these things in this list are things that were in play, that were in operation, and were not part of something new at Sinai. The appointed times, the sacrifice and offering. Cain and Abel made sacrifices. You know, the very first sons of Adam and Eve, or at least the first ones mentioned, sacrifice and offering. We saw sacrifice and offering in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who built altars and sacrificed burnt offerings. And so they had some sort of priestly duty before there was an established place for the priest to minister in Israel. This was, of course, before Israel, before Sinai. There were laws about murder and adultery and stealing and other things that we see pop up in the Joseph story, where he refused to engage in Potiphar's wife in adultery because he recognized that to be a sin against Elohim. And then there's murder, the murder of Abel by Cain. And so we see these laws that are in place and in operation. Distinction between clean and unclean. We see this in, I'm going to jump to the next slide and then I'm going to come back. Distinction between clean and unclean. In Genesis chapter 7, Yahweh then said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation." And it says, "Take with you 7 of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 2 of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth." And so we see not only in the sacrifices, because the sacrifices upon the altar of Yahweh were always clean animals, but we see it with Noah, who brought in animals into the ark based upon whether they were clean and unclean. The clean ones, there were 7 pairs. The unclean ones, there was only 1 pair of the unclean animals that were brought. And so there was this knowledge of this distinction between clean and unclean way before Sinai, way before the laws were given that we find in Leviticus. There were laws and right rulings in Torah. We find that Abraham was commended for his faith, and the promises made to him were reconfirmed as he spoke to Isaac, he said, because Abraham kept my laws and my instructions and my rulings. And it was on account of the fact that Abraham knew the laws and right rulings and the Torah codes, the sets of law regarding various things. Abraham kept these things, that he was commended. And so all these things we've looked at in past weeks, seeing that all of these things are pre-Sinai. And now we see that there was an order of priesthood, there was a service of priesthood, and there was tithing that occurred before Sinai. So tithing is not linked directly to Sinai or to the laws given at Sinai. Although it's a part of the instructions given at Sinai, it's not linked to it. It's not grounded in Sinai. Tithing is a principle that was established and put into practice before Sinai by righteous individuals such as Abraham, who gave a tithe to Melchizedek. And the tithe, and we're going to look into this again in more detail next week, the tithe was more than just what was growing in the field. For Abraham, the tithe that he gave was all of the increase of goods that he had received back and taken away from Kedor Laomer and the four kings associated with him. The plunder, when Abram took back all that plunder, he gave a tithe of that plunder to Melchizedek as a way of thanking Elohim for Elohim's deliverance in that battle that he had with the five kings. So again, these are things to consider as we move forward, and we talk about the Torah and how it applies, and as we look into the New Testament and what Paul has to say with Torah, that there were temporary things, but also that the Torah, there was an aspect of Torah that was permanent and everlasting. So we need to sort all that out as we delve into Paul. Tithing is one of those things that was given, and this is a little hint of something that we're going to talk about to come. Tithing was given under Melchizedek's priesthood. And what is Messiah? A priest in the order of the Melchizedek priesthood. So that's a little hint and a clue about where we're going with tithing, is that all of the reasons that Messianics give about not tithing, because there's no Levitical priesthood in operation, or Aaronic priesthood, Levitical service in operation today. Tithing is not about the Levites, although it was during the time that Israel was in the land. The tithing went to the Levites and to the Aaron's sons, but it's not grounded in Levi. It predates Levi, and therefore we should expand our thinking about tithing to include the Messiah, who is the true and legitimate high priest, and therefore the tithing is really linked and established in the time of Abram and Melchizedek. At least that's the first occurrence we see of tithing. And so we already looked at this clean and unclean. Pre-Sinai priests. I just want to mention this real quick because we're talking about priesthood. Noah built an altar and offered sacrifices. He was doing a certain work of priesthood, of mediation. He was offering burnt offerings on those altars. And on account of sin issues, but also on account of, there were other reasons for offerings, and those were thank offerings. They were gifts to the Most High, and those kind of things that are laid out in more detail in the book of Leviticus. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob also built altars and offered up burnt offerings. And these were, again, acts of priesthood. Potiphar, the priest of On, was a priest, although not a priest in Israel. This Potiphar was a priest in Egypt. But the reason you may remember this name is because Joseph married the daughter of Potiphar. Asenath was her name. And so we have mention of the priest of On, or On, I guess it would be pronounced. And he was a priest in Egypt. Yitro, who we looked at, I think, last week, Moses' father-in-law, was the priest of Midian. He was the priest of El Most High. And he offered up burnt offerings and sacrifices as a high priest would. And so we have laid out before us, pre-Sinai again, the work of the priesthood and the office of priest, even before Sinai. The altar, let's skip that one. It says, moving on with Melchizedek, and what we can glean from the scriptures about Melchizedek, we run into Psalm 110. And this is a psalm of David. It says, Yahweh said to my master, and this is David speaking, that David's master, and this was one of the riddles that Messiah spoke to the Pharisees and Sadducees, of which they could not give him a good answer. Yahweh says to my master, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And so how could, who was David's master that was going to sit at the right hand of the Almighty? And that was a mystery that the Pharisees couldn't answer. Yahweh will extend your mighty scepter from Zion. You will rule in the midst of your enemies. And so here David's master is a king. He's ruling and reigning over his enemies. He has a mighty scepter. It says your troops will be willing on your day of battle. So he's in charge of the army. Arrayed in holy majesty from the womb of the dawn, you will receive the dew of your youth. So David's master is this king, but he's also a priest. In the next verse, verse 4, Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Yahweh is at your right hand. He will crush kings on the day of his wrath. He will judge the nations, heaping up the dead and crushing the rulers of the whole earth. He will drink from the brook beside the way, and therefore he will lift up his head. So this king is also a priest. This priest is also a king. And it's done with an oath. And the writer to the Hebrews, and we'll get to this in a few minutes, makes a big point about the fact that this high priest, David's master, is established as high priest on the basis of an oath and not on a genealogy. He's a priest forever. Yahweh has sworn. This is an oath Yahweh has taken. He will not change his mind. And the word there means he will not relent. He will not go back on what he has said. This is firmly established. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So this priest is a forever priest. And we're going to read through that chapter 7 of Hebrews, where he goes into the details of several of these things that are mentioned here. The forever part is important. The priest, the Melchizedek, the order of Melchizedek, these are all important things. So Melchizedek was an order of priesthood. It's an order of priesthood. Melchizedek was both a man, and he established a manner or an order of priesthood. The word for order there is divrah. It comes from the word davar that we're familiar with. It means, the word davar means a word or a thing. Here, divrah, it's just basically the feminine form of that word davar. Divrah can mean cause or reason or manner, or in this case, translated order. It's the manner of priesthood that Melchizedek was of. It's superior. This priest is superior to the Aharonic priesthood, the priesthood of Aaron. Why? Why is this superior to Aaron's priesthood? Number one, it preceded it preceded Aaron. And we know that things that were established first are usually of most importance. And so this priesthood, because it preceded Aaron, it is greater than Aaron's priesthood. And also because it is still in operation. In other words, it succeeds Aaron's priesthood. Because Aaron's priesthood was set aside, according to the writer of the Hebrews. It was set aside, but the Melchizedek priesthood is still in operation. It was in operation before Aaron, and it's in operation after Aaron, and therefore it's a greater priesthood. It's established to be forever. It's established to be permanent. Levi paid the tithe through Avram to Melchizedek, and this is another reason we see why the Melchizedek priesthood is greater than that of Abram, because Levi, who was in the loins of Abram, who had not yet been born from Abram, was paying the tithe to Melchizedek. And so the argument is that indicates that the priesthood of Melchizedek was greater than the priesthood of Aaron. And then only one sacrifice was required. Whereas in the Aaronic priesthood, the high priest would go in every year and offer an offering of sacrifice, first for his own sins and then another one for the sins of the people. And it continued year after year after year because sin was never completely atoned for. That is, the conscience of the believer was never of the sinner. The conscience of the sinner was never taken care of. Sin was basically put on hold. It was basically atoned for in a temporary sense by the blood of bulls and goats. But in the case of the Melchizedek priesthood, of which Messiah came to be the fulfilling high priest, only one sacrifice was required, which makes it a greater priesthood. So how great was Melchizedek? And here's where we return to the book of Hebrews, and we're going to look at what the writer says. Think how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. Now the law requires that the descendants of Levi, who become priests, to collect a tenth from the people, that is, their brothers, even though their brothers are descended from Abraham. This man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi, this Melchizedek, yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. So the one who had the promises is to be considered the great one, right? Abraham was the great one. He's the example that we're always given about faith and how to walk in faith, how to please the Almighty. And yet, Melchizedek was greater than he, because Abraham gave the tenth to Melchizedek. And so think of how great he was, this Melchizedek. He was the one who blessed, because it says the lesser is blessed by the greater. So Melchizedek, the greater, blessed the lesser, who is Abraham, even though we consider Abraham the greater among, the people of faith, as listed in Hebrews chapter 11. And so this is how great Melchizedek was. Without doubt, the lesser person is blessed by the greater. In the one case, the tenth is collected by men who die. But in the other case, by him who is declared to be living. So the tenth was collected by Melchizedek. And the implication here is that the one who is declared to be living is fulfilled in the Messiah who is declared to be living. And so it's the Messiah who is the one that's collecting the tenth from those who die. You see the difference here? That Levi collected a tenth from those people who were going to die. Melchizedek collected a tenth from the one who is declared to be living. And Messiah is declared to be living. And the Melchizedek priesthood is in operation still. And therefore the one who is declared to be living is the one who collects the tithe. No longer Aaron and Levi, but Messiah is the collector of the tithe. The tithe belongs to him. One might even say that Levi, who collects the tenth, paid the tenth through Abraham, because when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. Levi had not yet been born, and he was several generations away from being born. So tithing was first done to Melchizedek. A Torah-based system of tithing could be to Levi and the priests, or to Melchizedek. Because the argument that Messianics give is that the law, the Torah, tells us and instructs us that the tithe has to go to Levi. And yet, that's only a half-truth. That's true as far as it goes. But the tithe was also given to Melchizedek. And that's part of Torah too. So the Torah teaches two tithes. And let me rephrase that so I'm not misunderstood.
Yeah.
The Torah teaches that tithe could be given to Melchizedek or to Levi. Melchizedek before Levi, Melchizedek after Levi, because Melchizedek supersedes Levi, and Levi is not in operation. The temple service and Levitical system is no longer in operation. Therefore, tithing is done to Melchizedek, because tithing precedes Sinai. Tithing is a principle that Yahweh gave to his people to honor him by giving to his high priest. And his high priest was Melchizedek in the days of Abraham. It was Aaron and his sons in the days of the sons of Israel in the land. And it's Messiah now for these past nearly 2,000 years. Messiah is the high priest and the Melchizedek that has a permanent priesthood. And so this is what the Torah teaches. And so we need to get away from this idea. And here again is where I'm challenging my Messianic friends. And I love my Messianic brothers. And I appreciate all their teachings and all of their insights. But I think they've missed something here in Melchizedek. Whereas they're trying to promote this idea that we need to rebuild the temple, reestablish the sacrifices so that Messiah can come, and that all of these other things can be put in order. Most of these things that we're commanded to do can be done without a temple, and without an Aaronic priesthood in operation, and without the Levitical system operating in the temple. We can be obeying the Torah and doing these things under the priesthood of the Messiah. The superiority of Melchizedek. Hebrews 7 goes on to say, starting at verse 11, if perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it the law was given to the people, why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aharon? So the Levitical priesthood, what he's suggesting here, was not meant to be permanent. It was a temporary establishment for the sons of Israel until the greater high priest would arise, that is the Messiah, and would take his place as the permanent high priest. One in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aharon, as he says here. For when there is a change of the priesthood, there must also be a change of the law. He of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar. So what he's saying here is that there was to be a change in the priesthood, and it was prefigured by Melchizedek, and it was fulfilled in the Messiah, and the book of Hebrews tells us all about it. But it's something that we have just kind of laid aside. We haven't really spent a lot of time investigating to understand what it all means for us and the implications for us. So the tribe of Judah, from which the Messiah arose, nothing is ever said about priesthood. in regard to that tribe. But there is something said, by David in prophetic utterance in Psalm 110, that his master would be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. For it is clear that our master descended from Judah, and in regard to that tribe, Moshe said nothing about priests. And what we have said is even more clear. If another priest like Melchizedek appears, one who has become a priest not on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. And here's where this mystery comes into play in this way of the priesthood. Just as the seed promised to Abram was not the seed according to Abram's ancestry, but it was a seed according to faith, so this priesthood is not on the priesthood of the Messiah is not on the basis of his ancestry, but it's according to his indestructible life and his faith, as it were, his faithfulness to the ways of the Father. And so Messiah fulfills this intention of Elohim, not through ancestry, but through a clean life, through an obedient life, through fulfilling all of those things he came to do and to fulfill from the Torah and the prophets. For it is declared, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, again quoting Psalm 110. The former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless, for the law made nothing perfect, and a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to Elohim. So this former regulation, and Hebrews is referring to the Aaronic priesthood here, the former regulation. It's set aside. This word, this Greek word, athetesis, occurs only 2 times in the New Testament. Here in Hebrews 7:18, where it means an annulment, a setting aside as being no longer in force. And that seems to be the impact it has here in verse 18. The former regulation is set aside. The Aaronic priesthood, he's saying, was set aside because a greater priesthood had arrived in the person of the Messiah. And then the other place where this word athetesis occurs is later on in Hebrews chapter 9, and this is what it says. Messiah would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world, but now if he were, of the order of Aaron, but now he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as man is destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, so Messiah was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many people. And here's the word athetesis, to take away, to do away with, to set aside, just as the prophets described under the spirit that Elohim was going to put on his people in the last days, that sin would be eradicated, it would be set aside. And so just as sin was set aside by the Messiah at the cross, so this priesthood was being set aside. The Aaronic priesthood is set aside and replaced by the greater priesthood, the priesthood of the Messiah in the order of Melchizedek. It says he will appear a second time, that is the Messiah, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. And so a couple of ancillary passages of Scripture. Matthew 27, it says at the time of his death, it says when Yahushua had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. And at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. And this is repeated in Mark's gospel and in Luke's gospel, the record of this, that the curtain was torn from top to bottom. What it's indicating is that a new way was being revealed into the most holy place. It was not the old way through the priesthood of Aaron and his sons, but it was a new way It was into the actual heavenly sanctuary, the place where Elohim resides in heaven, and that heavenly sanctuary. And so the earthly temple and sanctuary was no longer the way. The methods that were used in the Levitical priesthood, or rather the Aaronic priesthood, were no longer to be in play. But it was through the blood of the Messiah and by means of his mediating act as high priest on our behalf. He mediates the relationship between us and the Almighty by his own blood. And so therefore, the old way was being done away with, and that's why it was temporary. That way it was delivered and revealed to us as being temporary. It was only to be in effect until the new order was put in place. And it was not without an oath. And here's where he makes a point about the oath being taken by Elohim in Psalm 110. He says, others became priests without any oath. Aaron and his sons didn't have to take an oath to become priests. They were anointed and established because Elohim appointed them to this office. But this high priest, Melchizedek, or the one who came to fulfill the role of Melchizedek, became a priest with an oath. When Elohim said to him, Yahweh has sworn, but will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. And because of this oath, Yahusha, the Messiah, has become the guarantee of a better covenant. So because it's an oath, and Yahweh cannot and will not change his mind on this, it's a better covenant. Now there have been many of those priests, since death prevented them from continuing in office, but because Yahusha lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. And this is the other point of superiority of the priesthood of Messiah over the priesthood of Aaron, is that he lives forever. And the priests who would mediate between men and Elohim would die, and then a new priest would have to come in and take over the mediation. And so there was a continuity of sorts, but there was never that one individual high priest who took care of all of the mediation between Elohim and his people until the Messiah came. And he has a permanent priesthood because he lives forever. And therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to Elohim through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. And so he's not going to die and leave the rest of the work of the mediation to another high priest after him. He's always going to continue to live and mediate on our behalf. And that makes him a better high priest, because he's always there for us. He never fails us. Such a high priest meets our need. One who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. And he doesn't have to sacrifice for his own sins because he was without sin. So his once for all sacrifice for the sins of us was permanent and a one-time deal. And it doesn't have to be repeated because it's taken care of. For the law appoints as high priests men who are weak, but the oath, which came after the law, it came through David, through a prophecy to David, appointed the Son who has been made perfect forever. Hallelujah. So Messiah has a better high priest, and this is the high priest we need to recognize as the one that is currently in operation. And, whatever men may be trying to do in establishing a temple, and I understand that, my take on prophecy is that the Messiah is the one who's supposed to build the temple that he's going to reside in. And I can't remember the reference. I'll have to look it up for next week. And I'll give you that reference. It's the Messiah who builds the temple. It is Jewish tradition that says that that the Jews must build a temple in order for the Messiah to come. The scriptures don't say that. That's a Jewish tradition. And so whatever emphasis we may have on trying to support the rebuilding of a temple and the reestablishment of sacrifice and offering, the whole temple service, is, in my opinion, this is my opinion, and I think it's based on some good sound evidence from Scripture, is that we need to refocus our efforts on serving the Melchizedek priesthood and not trying to establish a priesthood that is going to be run and operated by unbelievers, by those who are in rebellion against Elohim and who hate our Messiah. Because the priesthood that they're trying to reinitiate is a priesthood based on man's laws and man's traditions and not on the ways of Yahweh. And so we need to take our focus off of that. In my opinion, you can do what you want if you have reason to believe that they're onto something good can come out of rebuilding the temple. I see the only thing coming out of rebuilding a temple is an Antichrist stepping in and deceiving the people and taking over the worship of Elohim like Satan is always trying to do. He's trying to usurp the place of Elohim and take over worship of Elohim and get people to worship him. And that's the only thing I can see as an outcome to a rebuilding of a temple by an unbelieving people. And so, I want to emphasize the Melchizedek priesthood, the Messiah's priesthood, and all of our efforts should be on behalf of the kingdom which he is establishing, the tabernacle of David that he is promised to rebuild. Matthew chapter 16, the promise, or what he spoke to Peter and his disciples, the rebuilding of this tabernacle of David. And so as the Messiah rebuilds the tabernacle, that is the people of Elohim, based upon true faith and obedience to Elohim and not on man-made tradition and law, we need to be on board with that plan and with that action, in our faith walk, and not on something that's going to bring in the enemy and praise to the enemy. So these are my takeaways from the teaching today. The order of Melchizedek precedes and supersedes the Aharonic order, and therefore it is superior. We are under the Melchizedek priesthood, not under the Levitical system and the Aaronic priesthood. Yahusha is the king and priest we serve, not Aaron and his sons anymore, which was set aside. Our gifts, offerings, tithes, etc. are to go to the ministry of Yahusha and the kingdom of Elohim, of which he is the head. We're told to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom, the true kingdom of Elohim. And that has to do with the king and high priest. Because didn't he say, behold, the kingdom of Elohim is in your midst. And Yahushua was referring to himself, that he was the personality of the kingdom. And upon his arrival, the kingdom of Elohim had arrived to the people because he was and is that kingdom of Elohim. He's the king, he's the head, he's the high priest. And so therefore our efforts need to be in the direction of serving him. We're going to talk about tithe in a couple of weeks and go into some detail about that. And again, here's a little preview. We should be tithing because it's part of what Elohim established far earlier than Sinai. But the tithe needs to go to Elohim's people. And I think the Christian churches have been teaching tithing and have received a lot of criticism from the Messianic world because of that, because they reject a lot of the Torah, but they bring forward those things that are beneficial to the church.
Yeah.
Things like tithing and whatever it is that benefits the church. But in part, I have to say that they weren't entirely wrong about the tithe. And in fact, they were right and just didn't know the reasons why tithing should belong to the people who are serving the Messiah. And so we're going to go into some detail about that. So next Sabbath, we're going to look at the Levitical order, the Aaronic priesthood, and what we can learn about the priesthood of the Messiah and how to serve him through the details and through the instructions given to us, especially in the book of Leviticus, about the Levitical system of priesthood and service to Elohim. And so that's what we have. I hope, hopefully it's something to look forward to next week. But anyway, that's where we're going next week. So that's my spiel. And so I leave the mic open to you.